thank you, Julie, our epistemological concerns, right? How knowledge and universities are structured by the history of colonization. But anytime we talk about it, what we are talking about is a relationship to land and physical spaces. And so that's something to consider. And one of the reasons why, well, we can start with this.
So we acknowledge the land on which we gather was once known as Tongvanar, sorry, a little nervous. This is the seized territory of the Tongva people, who were the original stewards of this land before we came to live here. There are still many Tongva peoples living in the Los Angeles region and caring for the land, and we still use many of their village names: Topanga, Kawinga, Pakoinga, Tahonga, Cucamonga, Azucanga. And so we're committed to uplifting Tovangar and the Tongva members who reside here alongside of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And we just actually, the Decolonizing Committee invited a Tongva elder, Julie Bogany, who's done tons of work to continue sort of telling the story and sharing the stories of the Tongva people. And I just found out the other day that she has fallen ill. So I'm just sort of sending out thoughts and prayers for her. Okay, so sometimes just the word decolonizing can kind of make your head spin, right? What does that mean? What does it have to do with teaching? And I like to look at this video because I think that it both illustrates and honors what it feels like when you start to
We'd like President Bartlett to aggressively support legislation that would make it mandatory for every public school in America to teach geography using the Peters projection map instead of the traditional Mercator.
Give me $200 and it's done. Really?
No. Why are we changing maps?
Because CJ, the Mercator projection has fostered European imperialist attitudes for centuries and created an ethnic bias against the third world.
Really?
The German cartographer, Mercator, originally designed this map in 1569 as a navigational tool for European sailors. The map enlarges areas at the poles to create straight lines of constant bearing or geographic direction.
So it makes it easier to cross an ocean.
But yes, it distorts the relative size of nations and continents.
Are you saying the map is wrong?
Oh dear, yes. Now look at Greenland.
Okay.
Now look at Africa.
Okay.
The two land masses appear to be roughly the same size.
Yes.
Would it blow your mind if I told you that Africa is in reality 14 times larger?
Yes.
Here we have Europe drawn considerably larger than South America. When it's 6.9 million square miles, South America is almost double the size of Europe's 3.8 million.
Alaska appears 3 times as large as Mexico, when Mexico is larger by 0.1 million square miles.
Germany appears in the middle of the map when it's in the northernmost quarter of the Earth.
Wait. Relative size is one thing, but you're telling me that Germany isn't where we think it is?
Nothing's where you think it is.
Where is it?
I'm glad you asked. The Peters projection.
It has fidelity of axis.
Fidelity of position.
East-west lines are parallel and intersect north-south axes at right angles.
What the hell is that?
It's where you've been living this whole time.
Okay. Okay, so we don't want to do that. Sorry, these are all the videos that my children are always watching. Okay, so one thing I really like about this video is it honors the fact that this is a little bit destabilizing. The way that we've been educated, many of us, has centered Western and European ideas about everything, including what the world even looks like. And so, you know, one of the things that people ask is, what's the connection between decolonizing and something like equity? And if you remember when Dr. Grant came to campus after George Floyd's murder, one of the things that he said is that as we're working towards equity, one thing that we have to do is start decolonizing. And so this is something from the National Council of Teachers of English. And they write, as long as we hold up the norms of the dominant social group in America and nothing else as the standard to which everyone should aspire in order to be deemed adequate, will perpetuate a system that rewards middle-class white attitudes and behaviors. and renders all others inferior, broken, and inadequate. So when we're thinking about things like inequitable success outcomes, one of the things we have to consider is how are we defining success? Success according to whom? And I think Sherry and Elisa talked really eloquently about this earlier today. So for me, my decolonizing journey really started and was helped along by professional development at SMC. And one of those things was the reading apprenticeship that that Edna Shavari organized when she was running the CTE. And what the reading apprenticeship does, and I've recommended this to everyone that I've spoken to since taking the class, is that it makes how we read in an academic institution visible, right? So some of these ideas of the hidden curriculum, like we'll assign something to students, be like, read these pages, but we won't tell them how to read it, right? And what they're looking for. And what it also does is it challenges us to change our relationship to students so that they're not just the recipients, passive recipients of knowledge, but they're co-constructors of it. And what it does is it positions discovery and curiosity over mastery. And so as somebody who went through a graduate program that was really predicated on mastery, right? Like if you didn't master things, you had no, right to speak, basically. This really was so liberatory for me to be able to go into a classroom with texts that I hadn't read a million times and read every single criticism of, and criticisms of the criticisms, but to be able to go into a classroom and say, I'm reading this for the first time with my students and we're learning about it together, right? We're co-constructing this knowledge. And so I was taking that just as I was prepping to teach world literature for the first time, which was like this thrilling synergy because in the field of world literature, it's constantly, and certainly at that point was constantly questioning, like, what do you mean when we're talking about the world? What do you mean when we're talking about literature? And so some of the books that I was reading at the time are in this image. And I just love that, like, one of them is, what is world literature? And the other one is against world literature, right? So there's really this kind of active conversation happening within the academic world about how these ideas are being constituted. One of the criticisms had to do with even the way that anthologies worked, right? Most anthologies at the time were organized around this idea of the West and the rest. So it wasn't necessarily world literature, it was like Western European literature, and then maybe something from South America, maybe something from, Asia, maybe something from Africa, right? Like those other continents. And even within Western Europe, there was, like, what about Portugal? What about like Switzerland? What about these, sort of smaller countries? And so, and then other critiques had to do with the way that even when other traditions were included, they were included as a way to familiarize other cultures by comparing them to Western models, all sorts of questions about translatability. So I really just kind of loved throwing myself into this and doing the thing that brought me into academia to begin with, which is just like pressing up against what I don't know, right? Figuring that out. So, I mean, I think that there's an incredible amount of pleasure in this in terms of, discovery and what we can learn. And also an incredible amount of cultural humility. It's one of the questions my other son asked me once was, Mama, what don't you know? And I was like, let me make a list, right? But so what I do is I start this class off with a poem by Lucille Clifton, who's a poet also from Buffalo, New York, who wrote this poem called Here Yet Be Dragons. And it reads, so many languages have fallen off of the edge of the world into the dragon's mouth. Some where there be monsters whose teeth are sharp and sparkle with lost people, lost poems. Who among us can imagine ourselves unimagined? Who among us can speak with so fragile tongue and remain proud? And so this poem is really a guiding light for me in general in life, but also a guiding light in terms of this class, right? And how we think about whose voices we center and include. So one part of this is just about kind of examining inclusion, but also looking at how the field is constituted, right? Like, how do we constitute world literature? And so the first assignment is to have students search for world literature syllabi, and then have them do an analysis of it, right? So based on this professor's construction of world literature, what does world literature mean? So what that starts doing for them is showing them that the canon, or what we think of as the masterpieces of world literature, is something that is constructed by what we read and what we assign. We watch this TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story, in which this Nigerian author, Adichie, whose novel Americana is just incredible, talks about how limiting it can be to have one narrative or one story kind of describe an entire culture, which often happens in world literature syllabi, where, you know, it's like, okay, we're going to read this South American novelist, and that's going to take care of South America for us. And then we also read Nguyen's Cannon Fodder, which is an article where he's a Pulitzer Prize winning author, but he talks about when he was at Berkeley and wanted to write about Vietnamese authors for his dissertation, and his advisor said, no, you won't get a job. So when we are doing this, we have to think about, like, why what we assigns value to that thing, and our students are aware of that. And then we just have to think about, like, why, or like, is the value always tied to some sort of, you know, marketability or something like that? So it's not, decolonization isn't just about inclusion, as I said. It's about, like, critically assessing how we constitute knowledge in our fields, but also inclusion matters, right? Students look for themselves in the syllabus. I taught in this class a Vietnamese epic poem, The Tale of Kyo, and I had a student who said, I've never seen anything from my background in a syllabus, right? And her response is, you know, she talked about her grandmother and how her grandmother would tell her this story, and that this was something that was hugely important to her culture. So one of the things we do at the very end, the final assignment, is what's missing, right? So I ask them to pitch an author or a text that they think should be included, and then talk about how the inclusion of that author would shape the class, right? Would shape the idea of world literature in a different way. And I've gotten so many amazing recommendations, and I've had so many things to read because of this. But what it does is it makes us all responsible for constructing the canon. All right. So that's my journey. Now I'm going to give it to Lisa.
So my own path, it's not as long as Shannon's yet, but coming into geology with this decolonial lens is something I've worked on for a little bit of time. And some of the notable points for me was reading a paper in 2018, which showed that Earth science, which is classified as geology, oceanography, and atmospheric sciences, is the whitest and the most male of all the STEM disciplines, despite 40 years of efforts to diversify in the field. Less than 4% of the tenure and tenure track professors are women or Black, Indigenous, people of color. So it's bad. And geology is kind of having its moment of reckoning with this because of how poorly we have done. So like right now, I'm currently participating in an NSF funded grant called Unlearning Racism in Geosciences. So that's that URGE. And the PIs of the grant originally had hoped they would get maybe like 30 pods, learning pods across the United States. Instead, they had over 300. And these are different colleges and universities in geoscience departments. And we meet every other week. We're reading papers, we're reading books, we're reading articles, as well as listening to speakers every other week and meeting within our pods. And looking at our own institutions to understand how our institutions interact and relate to minoritized people. One of the things we say in URGE is policy is our love language. So we're looking for places where we can equitize our policies to improve our outcomes for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So it's been a hopeful space, especially when we consider how bad geoscience can be. And so one of the things that I've been noticing in my own curriculum and my own classes is that, you know, the existing curriculum and the textbooks that we use, they leave out people who didn't have a seat at the table or didn't have a voice. And in science, that means leaving out women and minoritized people, or that almost as commonly, their contributions are attributed to others. There are several notable women, early oceanographers that had made really important discoveries, and we don't even have photographs of their faces because of their gender. They were excluded from academic spaces based on gender and race, and in many cases, their contributions have been co-opted by white men. So I feel like students have heard a lot about the Western European perspective for most or all of their education. And so one of the things that I try to do in the classroom is decenter whiteness, and as a white person, decenter myself from being the authority, and instead focus on contributions of scholars who don't make it into the textbook, but whose voices are important and need to be amplified. So part of this work includes acknowledging that the entire history of a person in the field. So one of the examples I have is John Wesley Powell. He's considered one of these founding fathers of geology because of his observations and his writings of the American West. He famously took a 3-month rafting trip down the Grand Canyon. He's widely revered for his push to conserve the American West. His name's on many, many signs on federal trails in the Western United States. But he's also a eugenicist. He studied the Utes peoples, and it was non-consensual. They didn't give their consent to be studied, and he did this study. He had a classification system of peoples, and he, placed them on that scale below being, below civilized. And he used this to help justify, or his work was used to justify government-sponsored programs and exploit this new land and exploit and expunge the Native Americans on the land. And so when we teach about this person, we can't just teach what's been sterilized or the good parts. I think we have an obligation to teach the entire person and the entire history, so that we recognize that some of these figures, these historical figures, were problematic, and that we recognize that. We don't ignore it or just say, well, that doesn't matter. It does matter. It is important just to say it. Another phenomenon I think we have to be wary of in the sciences is the idea of parachute science, when a first world scientist swoops into a developing nation and extracts, samples, extracts local and indigenous knowledge, and then uses it for their own advancement. And we may think, oh, that doesn't happen anymore, but it's still alive and well. And so the story with the blue whale here is in 2003, a Sri Lankan marine biologist, Asha DeVos, observed blue whales pooping in the northern Indian Ocean around Sri Lanka. She was super excited. She contacted her professors, she contacted other marine biologists, and you may be wondering, why does it matter that the whales were pooping? And the canonical knowledge at the time is that blue whales only eat in Antarctica, and then they move to the tropics to breed and to calve, but they're not eating there, so they're not pooping there. So she saw them pooping. That was a novel observation to make. And when she contacted these experts in the field, she was literally told, get us some research permits and we'll bring our team out there to research these blue whales. And it was appalling, right? So not only did these other researchers want to come into her home country and take over her observations, but they'd also asked her to do that logistical legwork to support their own work. And so that's sort of a egregious example. But I think over the last year, many of our, we probably have heard these conversations from colleagues as well. because of COVID and travel restrictions, it's really brought this into focus that scientists that travel to other areas of the world to do their work and then extract that without thinking about the help they get from the local people, they weren't able to do it. They weren't able to make observations. They weren't able to, extract that information. And then the last example, this was referenced already from the video clip that Shannon showed, but most of our maps, I know all of the maps that we use right now in geology are the Mercator projection, right? So that emphasizes a very northern colonial focus. And the strength of these countries appear because they're the largest on the maps. But of course, the map is distorting the sizes. And so a fairer or more accurate map would be the Hobo-Dyer projection, which again, it more accurately portrays the land area occupied not just by the US, but also Russia and Europe. And it correctly displays the size of South America, Africa, and Australia. And so I think they're really interesting to look at when they're side by side, because then you go like, wow, I know even when I look at it, it's like, gosh, I'm just not used to this perspective. But this is, the map on the right is far more truthful than the one that we're used to seeing on the left. So things to think about. Shannon and I kind of came up with these questions, and I think these are some of the questions we asked ourselves and that we still do, because I think that this work is more of a journey and not a destination. But think about who you're centering in your curriculum. And I know I'm constantly asking, can I do a better job of whose voices are being heard? And what I spoke to about like that hero mythology, who else was doing the work to support those historical figures? Because we often don't focus on their voices, and they're often the minoritized voices. Acknowledging the problematic pasts of historical figures. I think that we have an obligation to our students to do that. I don't think we necessarily should skip over these figures. I think if we skip over them, it's like erasing them. It's kind of like a form of inaction by not acknowledging what happened. Think about how knowledge is constructed in your field in general. That's one of the things we're grappling with in geosciences. The way that we even classify and use certain systems to classify, rocks and outcrops and what we're looking at. How was that constructed? And of course, it came from a very colonial perspective. And so is there a better way of doing that? Which kind of turns everything on its head. But, one of the beauties of, I think, having our students in the classes that we have is that they haven't been exposed to this. And so when you can give them a set of samples, for example, and say, how would you classify it? How would you break these apart? That's one way to tell them, like, you can, use your observations and you can come up with your own system. You don't have to be tied to, what we historically use.
Yeah, I think the last question is also really important. Do you acknowledge the connections between Western knowledge and colonialism? And so, within the fields like literature, there have been whole literary critical schools of literary criticism, like post-colonial criticism, that really look at this. But I think we very rarely think about the United States as a colonial space that continues to be a colonial space. And what that means for how we structure that knowledge. Okay, so one thing we talked about is what's next. And so this can feel pretty overwhelming. So my suggestions are to do things like find the discussion in your field. So this might mean looking at scholarly journals. If you go to our SMC library and look in the databases, search for decolonizing, whatever your field is, you'll find stuff. But I also follow a lot of people on Twitter and Instagram, like decolonize your syllabus, decolonize this place, and shake race, which is something that looks at the relationship between Shakespeare and race. So the conversations are happening. You just want to, get involved, see what people are talking about. I also advocate taking advantage of SMC support. So every stage of my decolonizing journey has been supported by SMC's professional development. So going to the MLA conference, PDC money, doing professional development like the reading apprenticeship, but like so many other things, the reading apprenticeship, applying for fellowship support. My sabbatical was like it was the greatest time of my adult life, I have to say. And George Davison just sent out an email that said that people aren't applying for sabbaticals. I would apply right now if I could, right? But you have to wait 7 years. So I would definitely suggest that, because it's a lot of work. It's a lot of reading. It's like really immersing yourself, because I mean, at least for me, like I was not trained from a decolonial perspective. I was trained from a very Western European perspective. You know, we read Native Son in my graduate colloquium and never talked about race. So it's, you know, it's a lot of it, it's just like an endless amount of learning, right? So it's nice to think of ourselves as being on the same journey as our students. And also you can take classes at SMC, you work at a college. Our colleagues are brilliant. And I actually just finished a Latin American Studies certificate. So I will be graduating this spring. And it's just been an absolutely incredible experience. And, you know, again, it's this pleasure of learning and coming up against what we don't know. So I would definitely suggest taking advantage of all of those things. And then also, we have this Decolonizing the Academy Senate group. We meet every other Wednesday from 2 to 3:30. And a lot of our meetings are really just conversations about what this work means and what it means in the classroom. And a lot of it has to do with not just what we're doing in the classroom, but what is happening institutionally, right? We can't create this kind of change if we're working within colonial structures institutionally, right? So how do we have those conversations? And a lot of what we talk about or try to do is just convene spaces where these conversations can happen. So this May 5th, we're having Professor Gina A. Garcia come to campus, and she's going to be doing a webinar where she's going to discuss some of the structural transformations that are necessary in order to truly decolonize an institution. So she looks at everything from, you know, like what are our vision statements, but also like what are our decision-making practices? Who's at the table? What are we funding? And then as a way of prepping for her webinar, we're going to have a series of community read conversations. We're going to discuss her book, which is available at the library as a free ebook. And then we're going to have a bunch of different practitioners on campus facilitate conversations about different chapters. So the first one is going to be led by Dr. Jenny Merlick on March 29th at 12:30 p.m. And you'll be hearing more about that. But then, as Lisa said, this work is ongoing. We're never going to learn everything. It's impossible, right? Like, and then there are so many things that have been lost, so many stories, so many people's experiences. But we can learn from each other, and I think really just kind of enjoy the discovery that comes when we don't think about knowledge as something to be mastered and just passed on, but something to be shared and co-constructed. Okay, so we also have a bunch of resources, which I'm going to put in the chat. So I don't know if you want to take people through this, Lisa.
Yeah, so it's just a few different websites, and I think these are just starting points. If you feel like you need some help, you're coming out of this super excited to decolonize your curriculum, and if you just feel like you need some help in like a week from now or a month from now, when you finally feel you have the energy to get back to it, it's just a great place to start and return to. And of course, we always welcome you to come talk to Shannon or I or anybody on the Decolonizing Committee, or come to any of the meetings as well. It's a very collegial group and a very we welcome people with open arms, and so it is a safe place where you can ask some of those questions and not feel any kind of judgment, and that will help you walk through anything you might be grappling with.
And here's a list of the people who are on the committee. See if there's somebody in your field or in your department. Otherwise, yeah, you can always email Lisa, or you can email me, and we're happy to answer questions if people are interested. We'd be happy to do workshops around this in the future. So please just reach out, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. If I can figure out how to do that. And then, okay. All right, so any questions?
Yeah, Mark.
Hello, thank you so much, both of you, for presenting this information, and thank you, Julie, for hosting us. Shannon, I really related to the world literature course. I teach a dance history course that's basically world dance history, and I'm, kind of been slowly working on it over the past several years. I've been teaching it. One of the struggles, which maybe you come up with, is this course in particular is teaching basically dance from the beginning of time until now. So it's a huge amount of information, and it's a survey course, obviously, and trying to just kind of balance the amount of information I have to share with my students against also the course outline of record, which is basically looking at predominantly dance in Western culture, concert dance forms, meaning like ballet, modern, and jazz, but specifically in the course outline of record states in Western forms. And we do have other classes that kind of help balance that. But now more and more, I'm just thinking as I'm going through the course, like I really need to address the course outline of record. And I'm wondering if you've had to do that and how that's been in your experience of doing that, but also in teaching. It sounds like you have to teach a huge span of information and how to get this kind of really more substantive work in there for your students.
That is such a wonderful question. And it's what's interesting is that the English department actually right now doesn't have an ADT. So we don't have a degree to transfer. So we are developing it. And in the process of developing it, we're going through our course outlines of record. So for example, the World Lit class that I teach, it's world literature from 1850 or the Enlightenment to the present. Well, the Enlightenment is a Western construction, like, so periodization, like, what we think of modernity, like modernist literature in Europe is different from what we would think of as modernist Europe literature in Japan and places like that. So we really do have to change a lot of the course outlines of record, and we're also shaping our ADT so that because we in my opinion have a very paternalistic relationship to some of the institutions to which we transfer students, and there's this kind of expectation that we're going to take them through the basics, and then they'll get to sort of challenge that when they get into their bachelor's program. And so to transfer with an English degree, you take a certain number of courses in American Lit and a certain number of courses in Western Lit. So we're organizing our ADT so that students, all of our intro to lit courses are going to take them through the literature of historically marginalized people, right? And so it's like this way to think about like decolonizing. It's in the classroom, but it's institutional. It's what's valued at our institution. It's what's valued at the institutions that we transfer to. It's how those relationships work. Like, do we get to decide what our own curricula is, or is it dictated from other folks? So yeah, you will probably have to look at those kinds of things. But I think, what's wonderful, at least about one thing I love about the English department is just, we've been working on it all together. There's just tons of people in our work group, and it's just been really just wonderful and gratifying, the kinds of conversations we've been having. It's just, again, it's like, this is why I got into academia. It's like, I love to think about these things. So it's been wonderful. Alan Buckley asked, are you working with the statewide academic senate on this? Not yet. Do you have a suggestion or a connection?
These basic course outline of records basically are all defined in statewide code. And those are reviewed and, updated periodically. And there's like a whole process in the statewide academic senate for doing this. And, our Senate could very well propose something to the statewide academic senate and make this, make sure that everyone in community colleges in California are at least thinking about this.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. That will be a next step. Susan. And Susan is also in the English department. I just saw her give a presentation on decolonizing the syllabus. So,
well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed getting to hear yours, and so appreciated that you were there at mine. And I, one of the things that strikes me is how difficult it is to get away from the problem of sort of tokenism, because we have 16 weeks. If at most you can teach 4 books, and you're trying to get this diversity and representation, and as you said so well, inclusiveness is what matters. So who you include becomes the canon of record to these students, because that's what they've read and that's what they know. So I guess what I struggle with, and I don't know that there's any one answer, is how do you decide what should be selected for that class? I mean, I've often driven classes by theme rather than genre or theme. I think are the least problematic in some ways, as to help make those decisions, at least in the English world. And I mean, a whole separate set of problems with science in terms of that, and especially survey courses, as was mentioned, in dance as well. But in not going by periods, I just heard that, in fact, I was just interviewed for an article for the high school world about curriculum shifts, because I spent about 40 years teaching in private high schools. And one of the big changes that Brentwood School is making is that they've removed 11th grade from being American Lit and 12th grade from being British Lit, which are, worldwide, the containers in which literature has been, designated for all students coming up over years. And occasionally 10th grade is called the World Lit. And what that means is they're going to do the Odyssey, or, something they can't fit in American or English. But I mean, this was revolutionary, and people are reacting to it, and all sorts of things like that. So I guess I think to some extent the constituency of the campus might drive it, but I'm just wondering what each of your thoughts are. But particularly obviously in the English department, since that's my field. But what drives in your course? How are you going to make those decisions, or how can we make those decisions in the future?
Well, I think part of it is just recognizing that, or like asking yourself, why am I teaching this? Like, what do I think is the value of this for students, and what values are associated with it? So I mentioned that we read Cannon Fodder by Jung, and he quotes a woman who was a professor of mine at Barnard, and she's just basically says, like, because the students at Barnard wanted a more inclusive English curriculum. And she basically says, like, if that's what they want, maybe they don't want to be English majors, because you have to read this, this, and this in order to understand that. And that idea of you have to read this because it's basically good for you. I had an advisor in graduate school who said, anytime that's the reason you're teaching something, you need to look at that. Like, why is this good for you? And so I think just asking yourself that question. I mean, for a lot of us, at least for me, I started teaching in 2006 at SMC, and I got somebody else's syllabus because I was hired as an adjunct like 3 days before the semester started. And I taught what that person taught. right? You know, and then I was able to change it over time. But in a lot of cases, we're just taking either what we learned or what was taught before and teaching that without asking these questions. So I think, you know, just saying to students, it's good for you, just like take this medicine, is not, it's ignoring what it is that they may need to know or what kinds of knowledges they value. And I know that we're out of time, but like one thing that's really important to me is to think about how when students enter a classroom, their native knowledges, whatever it is that they know from home or things like that, how is that valued in the classroom? And I, you know, like when I started college, I had a really thick Buffalo accent, and I had professors saying to me, where are you from? Like every time I would start speaking, they would interrupt me and ask where I was from. It was so, it's very nasal. And so I dropped it because I wanted to be taken seriously. And I could do that because I'm, you know, I'm white, and the thing that was making them think that I wasn't intelligent had to do with how I sounded, not how I looked. But like, what kind of messages are we sending to students about the languages that they use at home, the knowledges that they have at home? Is that something that we value in the classroom? Or do we basically tell them that you have to speak, talk, and know these things, and these things are valuable? And so I think making a space for students to be co-constructors is definitely a part of it. Yeah, same thing with the Southern accent, right? It's like, what was interesting to me is that then in graduate school, I had a lot of professors who had this transatlantic accent that they would put on, where it's like research instead of research, right? Like they're not from England, but if you speak that way, you are suddenly a genius, right? And everybody respects you. So yeah, so that's, yeah, a foreign accent period. Yeah.
Yeah, that's me. I'm like, that's me.
Lisa, I don't know if you want to
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, you bring up a good point, Susan. You know, we have to be careful we don't tokenize what we're doing. And I think that's why if we, in the sciences, you know, we look at the entire curriculum. And I started by looking at the fact that, you know, given that course outline a record, I was supposed to teach a certain percentage of history. And what was in the textbook for history was all, you know, white Europeans. And so I kind of started there, but then it's expanded so that every time we talk, because you know, it is a survey course, and so we talk about all these different units. You know, we acknowledge where that, you know, where that knowledge came from and who it came from, and you know, if there's problematic history there, and that, you know, it makes a difference when the students, you know, you see their ears perk up and their faces and their eyes open when you say, yeah, I know another dead white guy that we're learning about, but let's talk about these other people who also contribute to the work who aren't in the textbook. And the students start to, you know, I think, hear voices that feel more similar to theirs. So I think we want to be respectful of time. I see, Mario, that you have a hand up, but I want people to know if you need to leave to go to another workshop, please feel free to sign off. But Mario, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, I feel guilty because I came in so late. Sorry. I really wanted to hear this because this has always been something very important to me, because when I was in graduate school over at USC, I was in Comp Lit. And I got a lot of pushback from my instructors, both in the Spanish and English department, when I wrote papers about how important it was to study the works, especially Latin American, because that's what I ended up focusing on and bringing to Santa Monica College, in translation. They wanted to be purists and no, you know, it should be, you know, with both the Spanish and English, or just Spanish, or if we're doing the French, and the French. And it was a big issue. I graduated by a PhD in '93. But since then, and in fact, one of my papers was published about the importance of translations, because so many of the works in Latin America would not be available to American audiences or English audiences without the translations. But then now as I hear these conversations and in my own work, I in my Latin American literature class, which I no longer teach, I've turned that over, but in my regular English 2 classes, I'm always bringing in works that were written in other languages. I teach them in English. Where does that fit into this discussion? Are we, you know what I mean, Shannon?
Yeah.
Where does that problem fit in?
The whole world literature discussion really revolves around translation, right? And so like when we think about what gets included in a world literature syllabus, obviously it has to be something that's untranslated. Well, what gets translated? It's something that is going to sell to the larger English speaking audience. So it's got to be something that's familiar in some way. So one of the texts that I referenced at the beginning of the talk is called Against World Literature by Emily Apter. And she really goes through this whole conversation about how translation fits in with this. What is having a world literature class or department? What relationship does that have with complet? And so, so anyway, so yeah, no, it's a huge part of the conversation. It's something that we definitely talk about in world lit classes. I always teach a poem where we can look at multiple translations of it so that we can see that there's a kind of politics behind that as well. But yeah, it's definitely at the center of that conversation.
In fact, when I turned the class over to Cecilia Martinez Gill about 5 years ago, it was because she's a native speaker and I'm not. And she refocused the work in Spanish and combined it, Tony Trivis, and we're trying to put together the Spanish / English class that would be, Spanish speakers, whatever. Okay.
Yeah.
Somehow it feels like it may be a little more authentic than what I was teaching, because the majority of the works, except for the poetry, I could do both the Spanish and English, but the majority of the prose works had to be in translation. So just don't know if well, I don't know what else to say. I'm just curious about how that fits into colonization, decolonizing literature, et cetera, and so forth.
Well, like another thing that, and this comes up in the book that we're reading as part of the community read, is that a lot of students come in multilingual, right? Whereas like I'm a monolingual person. I've learned Spanish at SMC and I'm taking Cecilia's class this semester. But one thing some campuses are doing is having students do, when they do their assessment, do not just an English language assessment, but also like a Spanish assessment, so that we are valuing the knowledge and the language that they come in with. And then also, driving people into potentially being like Spanish majors or things like that. So there are a lot of ways that we can institutionalize those kinds of values around speaking multiple languages. But then, yeah, like, okay, so you speak Spanish, what about Quechua? Like, what about all of these dialects, right? So, reading people like Gloria Anzaldúa, who write and theorize a lot about what all of this means is a huge part of it. Yeah, there's not going to be an Esperanto. We're all going to be able to read everything. So acknowledging those kinds of limitations and putting that kind of value towards it is really important.
Good. Well, that helps. I appreciate you taking a few minutes.
Oh, no, of course. Erica had her hand up, but now I don't see her.
I was just going to respond to some of the things that Mario mentioned really quickly. I just find it really interesting, like in which spaces we have these kinds of conversations, and how in American literature and how it's traditionally taught, like we don't think about translation, like we don't have to, right? Translation is something that happens with other genres and other kinds of classes. And even the idea that there's this kind of singular text, right? Well, we can have a text, but it has different meanings and different interpretations in different contexts, right? So we can look at a text in translation and what does that mean? How is it interpreted, in a particular, cultural context? How does that shift? So, I mean, there's so many interesting questions that I think it's not just when we think about decolonizing, at least this is just, one perspective. is not just like what we're teaching, it's not just the assignments, but it's just like, how are we even looking at these things? Which kinds of questions have been kind of, segregated or siloed in other spaces? And like, what would it mean to talk about translation in an American literature class, like when it's never, traditionally taught that way? So I just appreciated that Mario brought that up.
Thanks, Erica. Now, Natalina has also had her hand up. I don't know if she's still
I
here.
don't know what happened.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm sorry about that. I don't know. I also wanted to say, even though I don't teach English, I have to say, or literature or anything. I'm a political scientist, and I usually use a lot of the same techniques that you were talking about earlier, Shannon. And I just wanted to reply to Mario because I was a Spanish literature major in undergraduate, and being that my native tongue is Portuguese, and I grew up in Portugal and Spain. Sometimes it would pay off to listen to the students. I remember my teacher and I had an argument about Gabriel Garcia Lorca because he was a Spanish speaker but not a native. So he actually totally missed the poem. And I said, no, I grew up with this. I know this, what he's talking about. And because I had studied it before at the University of Granada, but he would not take that as that I was a student, I was not to be the expert. But, sometimes, if you're doing a translation, like, sometimes I just laugh when I read Don Quixote in Spanish, or I read Cien Años de Soledad in Spanish, and then I look at the English version, I'm like, I could never finish this in English. I never did. I read it in the original language because there is so much missing, and maybe using those native speakers in your class, right? And you're talking about, saying 100 Years of Solitude, like the magic realism. How do you explain to somebody that never heard about magic realism, how does it work, right? And so that was my 2 cents of thinking back as a student, and now being a teacher, how you learning and teaching, because you all said it, we all learning. It's something that we all learning. So maybe sometimes our students do have something to contribute to us, right? So that's what I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Natalina.